Good morning, and welcome to the opening plenary panel on the employability agenda. I hope that you're all feeling not just inspired by what Gary said, but also rejuvenated by the caffeine fix that you undoubtedly got. So as Mary Jean said, we live in a disruptive age. Times are changing. The fourth industrial revolution is here upon us as we grapple with it. And before we get started, I'd like to personalize it a bit. This is very personal for me. I have two millennial kids. One of them is here, and my spouse, who's also here. All of these guys are actually living this revolution. So just to give you an example, my spouse has very successfully reinvented herself to cope with the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. She is a conventional English teacher in higher ed, has now reinvented herself as an instructional designer because she also realized that the coming challenges, the technology changes, etc., mean that she has to reskill and upskill. And similar to that, my kids as well, they are trying to grapple with their workplace, with their professional development, but also trying to keep up to date with what's happening in the world. And I think many of us in this room and beyond are facing these challenges and trying to tackle them. And to help us to unravel the mystique that Gary talked about, we have assembled an all-star panel here who are going to help us. These are the superpowers that Gary referred to. So let's get started. On my left, Roy Douglas, CEO of Advertech, a leading South African provider of higher education. He successfully led the company through turnarounds, through cross-border expansion, and he's not only going to help us understand the context here in South Africa, but also in the broader region. Next to him, Mona Mourshed, President and CEO of Generation. Mona supports public, private, social sector institutions and systems to raise education outcomes in the US and around the world. She has extensive publications from education to employment, getting Europe's youth into work, designing a system that works, and so on. And by the way, she's a globally known personality in this area. Next to her, Thomas Schaefer, Chairman, Managing Director of VW in South Africa, has had a distinguished career, not just in Germany, but across the markets that VW serves. He's worked in Malaysia, he's overseen operations in Latin America, Asia, and he's also going to help us to understand not just the regional, but the global context, because VW being a global provider in such a key sector that's being affected by the fourth industrial revolution, he has a lot of insights to offer. And finally, Monica Martinez from Mexico is Director of Global Alliances and Entrepreneurship at Tec de Monterrey, a globally known institution in the area of science technology. And she has extensive experience of entrepreneurship, innovation, and she's going to help us to understand that scene, how the fourth industrial revolution is impacting her and her institution and what they are doing to try and address these issues. So let's get started. Roy, let me begin with you. So South Africa is a very interesting economy because, you know, we look at it from the outside, it appears a bit of a paradox. It's advanced in many sectors. In other sectors, it's fairly nascent or emerging. In this kind of diverse, mixed environment, how are you coping with this kind of skills gap in the marketplace? How do you decide what programs do you offer? What's your focus on skill development? And what are you doing to address the challenges of this revolution that is on us?
You're right, we are a very interesting country with a very advanced and first world sector in some industries. Our financial services are certainly globally competitive and recognized internationally as being sophisticated and able to compete and stand on their own. We have a very well developed retail sector with globally competitive supply chain processes. So we have those first world elements, but of course there's also a very large developing emerging nation, as you point out. And of course, probably the statistic that's most telling of all is our very high levels of unemployment and underemployment, which I think reflects the skills challenge that we face. A lot of that is historical. You know, we were a country that for many, many years wasted generations with poor education, deliberately so, which was tragic in itself. And certainly, more recently, we've tried to address a lot of that. I think there is evidence and examples of where we've really tried to improve the education systems in general. It's acknowledged and recognized that we spend a significant percentage of GDP on education. And despite those efforts and policy changes and initiatives to try and improve our education and to catch up, in a sense, in many instances, and redress the problems of the past, we still, I think, have, and most people would acknowledge and recognize, a significant challenge. I think the problem is that a lot of those policies, as well intended as they were, have not necessarily delivered the results that we all would have hoped. And of course, the tragedy and what we need to avoid is where we lose further generations because of a lack of poor education, access to poor education. So from our point of view, we play a small, but we think a very important part in trying to redress some of those challenges, trying to improve the situation. We are, as I say, numerically relatively small. We'd love to be able to play perhaps a broader role, but there are ideological issues and challenges in the sense of the view of private education. But we think that if we looked at the challenge that South Africa and Africa generally faces in terms of developing skills, is that it's important we bring all the components to bear to try and resolve the challenges, to try and play a part. And we think in a well-constructed plan, that certainly would be achievable.
So we're going to talk about the role of government that you alluded to a little later in the discussion, but I want to pick up on something you said about underemployment. How are you tackling that? How does that come about, and how is an institution like Advitech dealing with that issue?
Underemployment, certainly, given the fact that there are limited opportunities in South Africa, and over the last few years we've had obviously very disappointing economic growth. One could argue, is that as a result of lack of skills, or is it actually other external factors? I think, cause and effect, and one could probably debate that. There's probably a combination of both, and certainly some of the policies we may have followed haven't necessarily had the outcomes that we would have wanted. But what we do is that, in addition to trying to provide education and skill sets that are meaningful in terms of the formal economy, we try to make people self-sufficient, and I think that's where Gary's talk earlier on was so relevant. Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication. And if we can empower and provide development and soft skills development in that area, then I think that goes a long way to helping people to be self-sufficient and to seek out opportunities in the informal sector, in entrepreneurship. And that's probably where we refer to the underdeveloped unemployment sector. And certainly, we see that as being very important, and it forms an important part of our curricular and development activities in our education facilities.
Thank you for giving us an understanding of what's happening here in South Africa. Mona, let me move to you. Now, you deal with similar issues, but on a much bigger stage, global stage. Help us to understand how you are tackling some of these challenges in light of the Generation program and how it's unfolding.
Sure. So Generation essentially recruits, trains, and places learners in a variety of careers, so across 23 professions. And I think what I would say two things, and they're really just two very different populations. So there are those that are currently in the workforce, but frankly, over this time frame, for all the reasons that Gary described around digitization, automation, there is a significant share of their job tasks that are being automated. And so they have to now figure out how to reskill in that world, otherwise they risk displacement. Right, so that is one significant population. And then there's youth who are today, particularly those who are most vulnerable, who are coming out of secondary school and are not finding jobs or able to go on to post-secondary education. And the question is, how do you support them to be able to quickly get onto a career path? And I think what we found first and foremost is that the nature of the profession and the dynamics around it vary hugely. So when you're dealing with professions of scarcity, so think of things like cyber information security analyst or robotics process automation, the ability to galvanize a set of employers to very quickly work with you to be able to create that cadre is much greater than if you are dealing with what I would call professions of scarce, of churn or high turnover. So think of healthcare or think of retail. Here, it takes much more effort, and you must have a return on investment fact base so that you can actually show that those that are coming out of this kind of a program, that they are still on the job 6 months out, a year out, and you have to work in a performance-based relationship so that you have that kind of a commitment with employers. Let alone when you're dealing with professions of productivity variation, where you have to be able to show that graduates of a program like this that they're able to get to proficiency in half the time or a quarter of the time as what would come out of a technical vocational system or whatever it may be. So essentially what we're seeing is that employers are struggling today to be able to keep up the pace of the reskilling or new profession category. So there is an opportunity there, but you have to have the return on investment fact base and create it with them so that they find it compelling to recruit and train in a very different way than what they are used to.
So it seems that there are sectors where skills are in short supply and sectors where skills are in reasonably abundant supply, but the challenges across, there's some commonality, but there's also some nuances across.
Yes, except I would say it's professions as opposed to skills.
Okay.
Right, so there are professions that are in scarce supply, and then you have to be able on the skills base to interweave the technical, behavioral, and mindset skills to be able to get mastery of that profession in a rapid period of time.
Right. So I think that's a nice segue. So we're talking about multiple sectors, so let's drill down into a specific sector. So Thomas, you're in a sector that I think more than most is actually living out the revolution that we talked about this morning as being impacted in major ways. Tell us how you as a sector and you as a company are dealing with this change, not just in South Africa, but in the broader region.
You see the whole automotive industry up and downstream is really in a revolution at the moment. And when you look at it, it's not only electric mobility and it's autonomous driving and shared mobility, but also the manufacturing part of it. And maybe I'll speak a little bit more about the manufacturing part. It's a huge challenge for us because we are a highly invested industry. I mean, we have 120 factories as Volkswagen alone in the world. So how do you change them into the Industry 4.0 new type factory with big data? And so there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And we think, specifically on the opportunity side, the availability of data, prevention of mistakes in production, the efficiency gain that you can get with it is massive. On the other side, the challenges are upskilling, reskilling the people, massive workforce that has to undergo the skilling process, going more into planning versus execution. And in countries like South Africa, where you actually need to employ more people than less people. So a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges, but we're all undergoing this in the industry at the moment, and everybody's trying to make the best sense of it, trying to work with the flow. South Africa is not any different than the rest of our operations. We are competing with any factory in the world, whether it's North America or Europe. We cannot just slack off and do something else down here. The industry is going one way, and you either go with it or you disappear.
Right. So one of the things that's very apparent is this whole debate about 21st century skills, about employability skills. You alluded to it, that there's a need for people who have to be comfortable with big data, with analytics, critical thinking. So Monica, let me turn to you then on that, because you, as Tech de Monterey, you have a reputation in science and technology. How are you addressing these particular skill sets in the 21st century? What is Tech de Monterey doing as an institution to help young people bridge that gap and also get ready for the jobs of the future, for the disruption that this revolution is causing?
Yeah. As a university, our main mission is to educate leaders for the new century. The point is that the future now is not predictable. And we are working in two ways in parallel. The first avenue of the change is to change and to transform all our education model, based now, up to now it has been linear, and now it will be very flexible. I will explain later. And the second is to bring the most innovative companies around the world into the campus, to focus our process education based on challenge and to solve the real challenge with the companies.
So in addition to the hard skills, and Mona and Roy, there's also this big debate about soft skills, whether the people coming out of colleges and universities, whether they have the ability to work in teams, in groups, whether they can communicate effectively, the soft skills that we often talk about. And I guess from both of you, we'd like to hear, A, as an institution, what are you doing to help young people? And you as a much broader platform, how are you trying to address this so that there's a good blend of hard skills and soft?
I think, this is, whilst it's certainly a challenge for us, and I think a lot of people are debating and discussing this as an issue, it's not something which is new. I think probably most of us here in the audience can quote cases where employers in the past said the first thing you have to do with a graduate is train them how to do the job. So often this has been a perennial problem in a sense of the expectation of what happens in the work environment versus the actual skills qualification that you talk about. I think what is different is perhaps the way that we're trying to address the problem. And one of the ways that we do that is we're spending a lot of time with students on counseling, preparing, investigating what are the skill sets that would be required in different industries and different businesses. Every business has a different culture, a different environment, a different way of doing things. And what we are trying to do in our career guidance programs is to forge relationships with industry, to understand better what their needs are, to address this kind of complaint that says, well, when they arrive here, we then have to actually start their formal training process. And that's something that I think has been very useful. One of the things that we have observed in the past, and particularly in South Africa, maybe because of the disadvantage that a number of people had, was that an education was seen as an end in itself. If I can just get an education. And of course, what we realize is that that's not really the end story. An education is a means to an end, and in fact, in many instances, is the beginning. So to try to get our students, to try and get our people thinking about, I have a skill set, but how do I apply that skill set? And that comes from, as I say, introducing a number of counseling sessions, interactions with employers where we try to find out more about their expectations of what the business would require when they arrive there. And we've built that into our programs to prepare people for the world of work. So it forms a very important part of our overall program, and throughout their 3-4 years worth of tertiary qualifications, it's something that we're focusing on preparing them for when they get to the place of work.
And that feedback and input that you get from industry translates into action in terms of curriculum redesign or adapting it and so on.
Yeah, very definitely. I think the specific areas around those collaboration skills, communication skills, that really is the area of focus. We can produce people who are skilled in programming, coding. What we are seeing more and more of is that the industries actually require people that can work in teams, who can understand and analyze needs, and who can communicate solutions, more than it is just the technical skills. And that is very important. Yeah.
And Mona, how is Generation embedding this suite of soft skills into the program? And I guess while you're describing that, could you help us to understand the scope of the program in terms of geographies and the scale that you are aspiring to or have already achieved?
Sure. So just as context, so Generation began about 3 years ago, and today we are in 7 countries, 65 cities, and 150 locations. We have 18,000 graduates and 1,700 employer partners. And as I mentioned, we work across 23 professions, so everything from robotics process automation to certified nurse assistants. So first and foremost, as we create each curriculum, we start, similar to what Gary mentioned, we focus on the activities, not on the skills. And it may sound like a nuance, but it's a very important one, which is you have to understand what are the activities that truly differentiate between high performers from lower performers in that job. And then on that basis, once you have that clarity, then work backwards into the technical skills, behavioral skills, and mindsets. And so if I just take the behavioral skills and the mindsets, and that's quote unquote the soft side. So what we find is that there are 4 mindsets that are constant across all of our programs, right? And so it's future orientation. So do you know how to make a plan and check your progress against that plan? Second is around personal responsibility. So when something goes wrong, do you blame yourself or do you blame the person in front of you? Third is around persistence. And the fourth is around growth mindset, right? You know, so in the spirit of Carol Dweck, right, of the brain is a muscle and repeat and intensive practice. So those mindsets are constant across all of our programs. The behavioral skills are a function of the profession. So for example, in healthcare, we care a lot about empathy, right? And it's absolutely core to being effective as a healthcare professional. For our Java developers, perhaps less so, right? And so essentially, the technical skills and the behavioral skills vary by the role. And the second thing I'll say is that the only way, in our view, to be able to successfully impart behavioral and mindset skills is in a technical context. So there is no such thing in generation of, here's a communication module, right? Or here's the problem-solving module. Life doesn't work like that. And so what we've done is we've integrated the behavioral, technical, and mindsets in each activity, in each day, for every single module. And so, and when you do that, then you can get to pattern recognition very quickly. And, and I think the third thing I'll just say is it's possible to very rapidly, and when I say rapidly, over the course of weeks, to be able to get someone to a point of mastery, not just of the technical, but huge variation in the behavioral and mindset, not just affecting their job, but also their personal lives. Mm-hmm. And that's really the nirvana, right? It's not just about making them effective professionals, it's making them more effective in their day-to-day lives, because that's how they'll thrive once they're in the role.
More well-rounded.
Yeah.
I like the way you framed that, the 4 mindsets. And I think, Thomas, we want to understand what your 4 mindsets are in VW and how you're dealing with them. And maybe they're not 4, maybe they're 6, or maybe they're 2, but what is it in the specific sector that you're in that you're grappling with as CEO? What are you doing to address it in-house? And also speak to what kind of collaborations you have maybe with training providers, educational institutions in country or globally that helps to find a solution to these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, as I said, we are a global organization, so we have access to other factories around the world, and they do lighthouse projects and develop certain skills in certain areas and then transfer them to the various factories. So we are not just doing it for ourselves. So here in South Africa, specifically, we have to get out of the mindset of the past of like, do the job, shut up and go home. It's how it used to be. You know, it's not cheap labor that we want people who are engaged every day with highly complex machines that come to work every day and want to make it better. And that's a fundamental mindset that you need in a manufacturing environment. People who see over the edge of their plate and come up every day with little improvements in the workplace. That's not natural. Specifically in automotive manufacturing, for many years it's been about efficiency. When you look a little bit more to the east, you have more repeatability of jobs, very small jobs, 1-minute cycles, you do it and don't look left and right. So for us, really, in this new world, it's more about opening their minds, being able to be upskilled and reskilled regularly, and be flexible, which is another dilemma in the South African labor law, how do you pay people with the skilling and everything, so it doesn't really fit to the old laws. But yeah, I would say so in that space.
But in terms of partnerships and collaboration with external providers?
Yeah, we work a lot with, also here in South Africa, with the universities, Nelson Mandela University, University of Stellenbosch, so we have interactions with them. On the global space, we work with, through our headquarter with like Messe Deutschland, they do robotation academies.
Right.
So there's a lot of external collaboration that we do. You need to, otherwise you die stupid.
And just Mona, in terms, Monica, sorry, beg your pardon. In terms of specific competencies and the mindsets that Mona was talking about, how is tech tackling this issue?
Yeah.
And maybe you can speak a bit about the pedagogical approach in terms of curriculum design, collaboration with industry, factoring in their feedback and so on.
Yeah. In that two ways I mentioned before, in the transformation of the education model, up to now, all the degrees were linear. You began to study mechanical engineer and you end 4 years after studying mechanical engineer and all the subjects around. Now, from the very beginning, if you choose the same example, a mechanical engineer, during your degree, you will have the opportunity to work with different colleagues from another careers, like humanity, business, marketing, sociologists, and so on, solving real challenges from the industry. For example, Volkswagen comes to Tecnológico of Monterrey and put on the table a real challenge that our students, researchers, and professors must to solve in that semester. And this is the first level of the vinculation between industry and the university. All this scope is to develop the main or the most important skills that we have identified, like leadership. We need to promote the leadership skill in our students. Global awareness. We need that all our students should be global citizens to solve global problems, okay? So the third skill is very focused on problem solving. If you are a psychologist or if you are a sociologist or if you are an engineer, you need to solve real problems with the help of the companies and to develop critical thinking. You must have your own opinion about what is happening, and you must have the curiosity to be informed about that. Ethics and citizen social responsibilities vary indeed our education model. All of our students have the obligation to have one semester dedicated solving real social problems, working in different and multidisciplinary teams as well. And teamwork, of course, and written and oral communication, and of course, entrepreneurship and innovation. All of these blended in a package, education package, where 100% of our students must to have an international experience abroad, because we want to generate global leaders.
Great, thank you. So I guess we've talked about the blend of skills, hard, soft, analytics, big data. We've talked about producing well-rounded people who not just have a set of skills, but have an attitude, an ethical sense, are part of a global community, which brings us to, I guess, the broader notion of why people want to go into education. And I know as a parent, I want my children to definitely, benefit from the joy of learning, the pure joy. But at the end of the day, I also want them to have a productive life and a career. And I'm hoping that their education will lead them to that. And I think a lot of us are like that. So Mona, so as a parent, I want a return on my investment. in education. I'm sure a lot of young people want that as well. So at Generation, how are you kind of bringing this concept to life? So do the young people that go through the program, how are you ensuring that there's a ROI that means that there's an incentive for them and a motivation for them to join the program and they see the light at the end?
Sure. Maybe just as context, in the skilling space more broadly, the evidence on return on investment is actually quite limited. Right? And I say that in terms of, so obviously, yes, there's been much research done on, those who have a college degree, have higher net incomes over their lifetime, et cetera. Fine. But when you look at, let's just call it the technical vocational space. That is much more limited. And frankly, when you look at existing research, so for the learners, and ROI here, let's define it in terms of personal and financial well-being, much of the research, to the extent that there is research, it shows fade out. Right? And for employers, there's just a data scarcity. It's just a data vacuum in terms of whether there is an ROI for employers for participating in these kinds of programs. So when we built Generation, it was very much with a view of there not just has to be an ROI, but it has to be over multiple years so that you can actually see that it sustains. And so for Generation, for our learners, we do look at personal and financial well-being, and that is everything from your income to your healthcare outcomes to those of your dependents, and how a Generation graduate being financially independent supports their family. And I'll just say that for Generation, so our learners are typically ages 18 to 29. Many of them come from deeply challenged backgrounds, and after Generation, they're immediately able to earn 2 to 6 times in income what they were earning prior to Generation. And cumulatively, they've now earned over $55 million in salary. At least 40% of them have dependents. So that could be children, or it could be siblings, or it could be elderly parents. And we also track their outcomes as well. For employers, we look at business outcomes, right? So productivity of our graduates relative to non-Generation peers, quality outcomes, retention, speed to promotion. So I can say things like, for example, for our IT help desk program, that our graduates have, at 6 months, have 4 times the retention of their non-Generation peers. We can say that for our certified nurse assistants, that they save their nurse supervisors over 30 minutes per shift, which we can then monetize and turn into EBITDA. We can say things about speed of promotion and so on. And it's only if you can make that kind of a case that we believe that participation by both employers and learners can be systemic.
Right.
And that has to be true in order for this type of a solution to actually thrive.
Right. And Roy, how about you? You're an educational institution. In your enrollment sales pitch to the marketplace, is that a factor, or are you focusing more on the kind of skills that they'll develop for the new economy and for the 4th industrial revolution, or is there also a financial payback that you're promoting?
I don't think we're as sophisticated in the sense of measuring that outcome as Monica has described, and it certainly it's perked my it's perked my
Sorry, the MON is a problem.
Simply taking the lead from you, Mac. And I think it's really interesting, and perhaps that's something that we could give consideration to, so that we could build a database and a trend and see what successes we're having in that area. Our experience tends to be more on that one-on-one basis. For example, our Rosebank College brand focuses very clearly on a quality education which is affordable and leads to employability, and the employability is the key for us in that instance. So the interaction that we tend to have is to try and build the relationships with employers, understanding what their requirements are. We try to find blue-chip quality organizations that will provide meaningful careers for our graduates thereafter. And when we engage with new prospects on that basis to understand their organizations, then try and make sure that we've got the right candidates from our system to match with that, And then we track and monitor as it goes with those individual organizations. So it's on a much more kind of individual case as opposed to an empirical study, which I think would be very valuable, and we would really need to see how we can add to us, to our area in that basis. But what we find then is that so we can understand which are the successful candidates, why are they successful, and then we can try and match those kinds of attributes and skill sets and personal attributes, I suppose, values in a sense, to those organizations. That's worked very well for us because we have had examples where a merchant banking company, for example, which would probably not necessarily view some of our institutions as a traditional base for recruiting, but when they've had an experience with our graduates, have forged a strong relationship and come back and asking for more and more of our candidates. And I think that's the essence of the success that we've experienced.
And I think that just underscores the importance of analytics and data and metrics that we were talking about earlier. Maybe here's an opportunity for you guys to collaborate and
Sounds like it, yeah. Mona.
benefit from Mona's considerable experience. So let me turn now to an issue that we don't often talk about at IFC, but I think it's critical, and that is the role of government. Have governments missed the boat on the fourth industrial revolution? Are they on board? Are they up to speed? And what role are they playing? And this question is for all of you. You can address it individually in your particular field of work, sector, etc. How is government either facilitating and enabling or hindering? So, Monica, why don't you go first?
In our case, as a private university, we lead the process, all the processes. In the case of the district on innovation that we are developing, and that will be the biggest in Latin America, we are working very close to the government, all levels of government, even the local, the regional, and the national government, especially to have some influence over them, because we need that they facilitate things like how to attract the best talent in the world for our district, how to attract the most innovative companies to our district, and we have now in Mexico some regulations that could be updated to the new century, and we are influencing in the government that they will be enable all the process to attract talent, investments, and so on. This is the main kind of relationship we have with the government now. And in the business as usual, on education, usually we lead this other process.
Thomas, you deal with obviously the host government here, but you've in your career dealt with others. And so how do you see the role of government?
Well, it depends on the country we're talking about. I mean, if we talk about South Africa, I think on the high level, in the universities and corporation and so on, and focus there, it's not too bad. What we are battling with here is basic education. 70% of the grade 3s can't read and write. The kids that come out of school have never had the chance to experiment with chemistry, put two things together, something goes up. Yeah? So how do you excite people for engineering if they've never fiddled with anything like this? So we battle with the basics here. And then going further, the question of getting government's head around the development of the auto industry globally versus the local demand of employment, of putting more people in, working against efficiency. So it's a bit of a tough situation at the moment. I think government's more and more wrapping their head around it. We're not there yet. But I've seen it in other countries. We're dealing at the moment intensively with Rwanda, for example. Unbelievable focus on training, development. It can be done. It's just a matter of focusing. So am I happy? No. Here? No. Going forward in Africa? Yeah.
And Mona?
That was very succinct.
Are you finding in your different countries, are you finding the role of government to be supportive, positive?
Yeah, I mean, so look, obviously, as with all questions, it depends, right? So here's what I'll say, though, and again, I'll focus specifically on skilling. the vast majority of money and people in skilling is sitting in the public TVET systems. So unless we're going to find a solution to these things, then we're dabbling on the margins. So what we've been doing in Generation is we've actually embedded the Generation method in TVETs in some of our countries. So in India, we're in the state government of Odisha, and so we've embedded it there. In Kenya, we've also embedded in some of the TVETs there. And for us, this is really important because unless we can have proof points like this, then, yes, of course, we can embed our method in other nonprofits and but it's just not going to be enough. The scale is there. You have to be able to find a solution there.
So we have to continue to work with governments rather than against them. Roy?
Yeah, I think my experience, of course, is much more South African-based and orientated, and it is a complex question. I think you'd have to say at a macro level and judging the outcomes, then South Africa and its focus on education, its interventions, have been disappointing. Thomas has alluded to the fact the illiteracy levels, the high number of children that leave school before they even get to a matric level, the failure of a number of our TVET systems. All of that at an outcomes evaluation is extremely disappointing. I think that would only be part of the story, though. I think where government does have to give credit is that it really has applied its mind to the problem of education, and in fact it inherited a system which was clearly unfair, unjust, and whilst it created small pockets of excellence in perhaps our public tertiary institutions, for example, it ignored the majority of the population. That's clearly an unsustainable practice. So there needed to be change. There needed to be radical change. I think where the problem probably comes is that what was implemented, what was introduced was perhaps ideologically driven with the best of intentions, but the outcomes have been disappointing, and I would say, and we really are still facing a significant, a massive challenge in South Africa to address the education inequalities. I think what we'd like to see is perhaps seen as some of those initiatives on the part of government which were well-intentioned. I mean, our percentage of GDP spend on education as a whole, the CETA system which attempted to encourage vocational training but failed miserably for kind of implementation issues in a sense. We'd like to see a revision of that and perhaps a learning from the past and a quick response to take the significant resources that this government has been prepared to allocate and turn it into much more focused, positive-based outcomes.
Yeah. So I think that issue resonates with a lot of our participants here because they're primarily from emerging markets and dealing with similar challenges and governments that are either not fulfilling completely the promise, the political promises that they make, and when they face their financial and budgetary constraints, they have to obviously to compromise on that. The one, so we spent a lot of time talking about youth and skills and skilling and so on, but you had alluded also to reskilling, and maybe that issue is relevant for your initiative, but also I think for Thomas's company because VW, I would imagine, has workers of different calibers and different age groups. So perhaps Thomas, you first, and then Mona, you could talk about how you're dealing with reskilling of older workers, and what kind of challenges are you foreseeing or experiencing in that?
It's a day-to-day business. Like here in South Africa, we have our in-house training facilities as well as external. I would say we have out of our 4,000 people that we have here, it's probably about like 10 who are objecting and don't want to be trained like real old guys who think retirement's around the corner. I'm not doing it. But that's a huge exception. I think what I find in South Africa is that a lot of people of all age groups, they actually want to learn. They're keen on learning, and you provide it, they do it. I don't really experience resistance except those 10. Anyway, yeah. We'll find something else for them, it's fine. Right. At the end of the world.
And Mona, is Generation specifically addressing the needs of such older workers?
Yeah, so we've, just this year, we've piloted a variation that we call regeneration. And regeneration is focused on an older age bracket whose jobs have been displaced or who are at risk of being displaced due to automation and digitization. And so, for example, if you're in retail, many of these jobs are reducing. And so could you now become a digital marketer, for example? Or could you go into healthcare, which is a high demand profession in your area, whatever it may be. And so we are doing 3 pilots this year in different geographies with regeneration. And what's clearly come out so far is that you're obviously, so we're using the same method of generation, but you're dealing with a different learner profile. So someone who has been working in a particular job for, let's say, the last 20 years, they're dealing with a lot of anxiety about how do I make this shift. Often they're also dealing with a lot more financial pressure because of obligations that they have racked up over time, as well as to their dependents. And so you have to fix that first. You have to get someone ready to learn, ready to engage. And that's wave 1. And then you can actually then get through then the rest of the actual program. And then for generation and regeneration, we also provide support for the first 6 months on the job. And so I think what I'd also say is you can't just look at this as reskilling means just retraining, right? Literally, training is one of 7 things which we do.
Right.
And if all that we did was training, we would fail. Right? And that's true both for generation and regeneration.
Sure. No, I agree. I think it's a shift in attitudes and behaviors. You have to incentivize the older worker in a different way. Yeah. So thank you, panel, for helping us to unpack this fairly challenging topic and setting us up for the next 2 days. I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. There are mics. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and compose a short but succinct question. You can address it to individual panelists or to the team. Let us know. Yes, sir. Is there a mic?
I think it's behind.
I get to line up.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
My name is Sohaib Batarji. I'm the president of Batarji Medical College in Saudi Arabia. Can I address my question to you?
To me?
Yeah.
More than welcome, but I think it might be better if you had a question for me, we could do it offline.
Yeah, but
in order to respect the time and presence of our panelists, why don't we focus on them?
They have addressed my question earlier. My question is to IFC. What are they doing about government bureaucracies? Thank you.
I didn't quite catch that.
To the IFC, what are you doing about government bureaucracy?
What do I think?
What is the IFC doing about government bureaucracy?
That's a fairly broad question and probably way above my pay grade, but let me take a stab at it. So IFC, as you know, the mandate of IFC is to help to develop private sector in emerging markets. We've been around for 60 years. We think we have moved the needle in many sectors, including education. There's a lot more to be done. Having said that, we recognize that government plays a vital role because in many of the markets that we serve, education, for example, is still considered to be a public good. It's highly contentious in the private space. There's lots of ideological opinions and views on this. So we think government is a key stakeholder in providing the enabling environment in regulation and public policy and so on. So we work very closely with our colleagues at the World Bank and help with them and help to work with host governments to try and unlock regulatory gridlock in some places to help to make it more open. And the bureaucracy that you alluded to is just a fact of life, that when you deal with governments, you deal with a vast infrastructure and that moves at its own pace. Sometimes that pace is glacial, sometimes that pace is reasonable, and it's part of the challenges of how we work, and we try to facilitate as far as possible. So let me leave it at that, and we can certainly discuss it offline. Other questions?
Thank you. My name is Rajiv Gupta. Our company MLE, we provide a learning management system designed for Africa. Question is for Mona. One of the models one of our clients in Kenya is trying is to scale up TVETs using e-learning, where majority of theoretical work or learning will be on mobile phones, and then the hands-on work will be in a shared space similar to Fab Labs or Gearbox and other companies. What's your experience in scaling up skill development, which is heavily hands-on? How does a government like Kenya, with very limited funds, scale up to 3.1 million that they are targeting this year? And that problem is across the continent, and I'm sure Thomas will need more and more workers which are readily available and trained on latest technologies. So, thank you.
Sure. So let me say two things here. So one is that we are actually experimenting with a program that is 40 to 60% digital, and the rest is in person. We have been able to experiment with different methods through digital to provide the practicum. And we've actually been pleasantly surprised as we've done that, because we began as a purely in-person physical program. And for us, because we're dealing with quite vulnerable populations, we believe that this program will never be 100% digital. It's very important to be able to engage in person for at least a share of that time, to be able to not only build a trust level with the individual, but to create the peer and the community bond, which is so important for them to thrive well beyond the program. But we do believe that now that you can get to 40 to 60% digital, and that view, that realization has happened over the last 6 to 8 months. And so we do believe that that is a mechanism. Now, obviously, the pace at which we can use that varies in our geographies based on the mobile penetration, et cetera, right? But that is something that is possible, certainly. The second thing, though, is that it's really important to recognize what are those activities where you need to be in the same time and place versus those that you can actually do digital. And there is often a view in the space, as we were exploring this, that you need to have these, high-end simulations, et cetera, needs to look and feel like a video. It doesn't. Actually, what we found is that the grainy type of experience where you sort of turn a cell phone onto yourself and record, and then someone else is being able to provide you with feedback on the other end, that's actually much less intimidating for our young people than something that is polished and looks more complete. And actually that's good because it's less costly as well. So we've been having insights such as that as we've been doing these experiments, but we'll be rolling this out in multiple of our geographies over the next 18 months.
Thanks, Mona. Other questions?
Hi.
Yes, sir.
It's
from
another
this end?
question.
Sorry, can I ask from this end?
No.
I've been waiting. Yeah, Kennedy Mubaiwa from Hala Foundation, Harare, Zimbabwe. My question is to Roy, and I've got another question for Thomas. I was just having a debate with my colleagues last week. With what Gary shared in the earlier session, is there still a role for a former teacher as a headmaster, given where technology is taking, or given the types of jobs and the type of teaching and the type of children that must come out of the schools to enter into the future that's coming towards us? That's my question to Roy. And then to Thomas, my question is industry going to continue to wait until the student comes out of the university, or is there a role for industry to now actually step in and be part of the whole process so that we don't have to, go through upscaling, rescaling by the time the student is trying to get into the job? Thank you.
Thank you. 2 questions. Roy.
Very definitely. I think you'll hear it consistently. Man has just referred to the fact that whilst technology is a phenomenal enabler and can really aid in the learning experience and help to develop skills and attributes, I think the role that the teacher plays and the human interaction is still critically important. If we look at our range of schools in our portfolio, there's a direct correlation between the most successful of our schools on any measure that you'd care to mention, and the principal, the headmaster who leads that school, who sets and creates the right environment for teachers, well-motivated, clearly directed, for parents, communication, understanding their expectations and providing feedback, and for the children themselves and their learning experience. So in my mind, there's absolutely no doubt that there's still a very important role for the teacher as a leader, as the primary giver of teaching and learning experience. Technology, fantastic enabler, can help us in terms of the delivery mechanisms, can lower the cost of delivery, all sorts of advantages to it. But in my mind, the role of the teacher is still very critical.
And Thomas, you've had time to think of an answer.
Wouldn't have needed it anyway. Look, I certainly think that the days are over that you wait until the kid drops out of school and you take him and then you do something else with him. On the other hand, I don't think infiltrating the schools with all sorts of technology and trying to get the one or first year kids into car people is also not right. So you got to have some balance in between. Here in South Africa, we do a lot of work with all levels of school, trying to work with the curriculum, see that everything is taken care of. But I mean, the work we do today might not be relevant for in the next 5 years. The whole industry might have changed to something else. So
right.
Basic skills and the soft skills, yes, but I would say a balance is right. Don't infiltrate too early.
Yes, sir.
I'm not here to ask a question, but to actually answer one that the facilitator was asked to. My name is Sheikh Umar Saidi. I'm IFC's Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa. There was a question on government. Two parts of the question. Part of it was answered by the facilitator. We work at the sector level. The government is very much a partner to us, and part of our job is to work with our World Bank colleagues where we bring in the private sector dimension to make sure that if there are things that are making it difficult for a private entity to operate in a particular space, that we advocate in a positive way to try and change things to make it possible for them to operate. So that is one role that is critical to what we do. We tend to be known only for the investment work that we do, but the advisory component of our work as a privileged partner to government is extremely important. So I wanted to highlight that part. The second part is that if you happen to be involved in a particular investment that is facing difficulty, and we have had that experience in a school system that we strongly and we continue to believe very much in East Africa with two governments, where we have been very upfront, meaning that we've been proactive in talking to the decision makers about what is it that we're trying to do. If there are questions that are not clear, we try to address them in a very forceful but very respectful way to make sure that our perspective is heard vis-a-vis our particular investment, and it has been relatively successful in a way that we've engaged in this particular outfit in East Africa, specifically in two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umar. I think you articulated it much better than I did. So, final question, because we have about a minute left.
Cool, thank you. My name is Dominic Shaw from Zelda Learning, based here in Cape Town. So people don't actually want jobs. We're talking about people getting jobs here, but people don't want jobs, people want meaning. Jobs are just a way to support us so that we can get meaning or find meaning somehow, and sometimes for the perks that come along with that. But right now, we're balancing jobs with meaning to kind of, that's the best way we can find to give meaning to people while supporting them as well, is finding meaningful jobs. But as Thomas mentioned, things are going to change very quickly, and in 5 years' time, we don't know what the world's going to look like. The whole idea of the singularity means that it could happen any day now. So this is a question, I suppose, for Thomas, particularly as part of a company that can play quite a big role in the world where people are trying to find some kind of way to support themselves in a very fast-changing world. How do you see VW or larger companies, huge kind of multinational corporations, dealing with the potential to lose loads of jobs? I mean, you say that government is in South Africa is working against efficiency. So I assume you mean that efficiency is actually not having people get jobs, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe UBI is a great idea. So what can industry do if we're getting rid of jobs to make things more efficient, to make sure people can still find meaning in the future?
Look, it's a difficult question. When you look at, for example, electric mobility, electric vehicle has got 60% less parts than an internal combustion engine vehicle. 60% less parts means 60% less labor hours, means 60% less suppliers. You make the math, do the math. So it is not really a problem for the or triad markets, or like Europe, US and so on, or China, where population declines. Because there it actually goes very well with unavailability of young, skilled labor. It's the way it is. Here it's a catastrophe. So the only way is move forward and find ways to grow. And I'm not spending half my time in Africa for nothing. Because it's the next growth market, and it has not been unlocked, not because there is no potential, just because we haven't found the key to unlock it. And we all try and wrap our head around it, how to do it. My personal opinion is move away from pure manufacturing to mobility. When you think of how many people in sub-Saharan Africa have got $20,000 to buy a new car, versus how many people have got $1 to $5 or $10 in the pocket and need to go from A to B. So if you get into that market and you start combining that with manufacturing and industrialization, all of a sudden you probably have a solution to the difficult environment around here. So Europe and rest, not really an issue, here issue, but other solution. Don't know if that helps. I don't know more either. So,
All right, we're out of time. So thanks to the superstars on stage who made my job really easy. And thanks to you for being a wonderful, attentive audience and for engaging with us. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, sir.